Welcome. I'm Susan Young Life Coaching. And today we're going to talk about being. And one of the ways we're going to approach that is by what's called flow, the flow state. That's our kind of entry point. And learning more often how to enter the flow state through choice. Some of us have already probably achieved it on our own. And maybe it's been built on by your meditation or mindfulness practice, but the actual capacity to do it, we can learn more about that. So I'm going to show you, here it is, this little video. Okay, let's get you little. Can you see, let's see, can you see a guy with furry eyebrows?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm just going to play you about a minute. This is a longer 7-minute YouTube video by someone named Steve Kotler, who's a very interesting man who's written books. And so he's kind of pulling together the research on flow. And the man you're seeing here is Mikhail, I can't pronounce his last name. You'll see it in a moment. And he's talking about flow. So I'm just going to play this a minute of the whole thing, and I'll send you the link and you can watch the rest of it if you want.
High is often referred to as the godfather of flow psychology.
So this is the fellow Steve Kotler, the one we just saw, Mikhail. He's the one who's considered the, he called him the god.
He was very interested in sort of well-being, meaning of life, and he went around the world talking to people about the times in their lives when they felt their best and they performed their best. Everywhere he went, people said the same thing. I'm in this altered state of consciousness where every action, every decision I make seems to flow effortlessly, perfectly, seamlessly from the last. Flow actually feels flowy. More specifically, it refers to any of those moments of rapt attention and total absorption. So focused on the task at hand, so focused on what you're doing, everything else just seems to disappear. But one of the things that athletes talk about a lot is what they call the voice. Often when I'm skiing in flow, I will get directions, right, left, do this, do that. And it's very quick. You either do what the voice is telling you to do, or you tend to crash. The challenge skills balance is often called the golden rule to flow. And the idea here is pretty simple. We pay the most attention to the task at hand when the challenge of that task slightly exceeds our skill set. So to do this work and to get good at it, you have to get good at being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So you want.
So that's what I thought we could do today. I think we're all familiar with it. So I wanted to hear, so what they say is the idea is that we want to be familiar enough. And if we think of our regular meditations or how other ways we practice mindfulness, we want to be comfortable enough and familiar enough with our practices of being in the flow of being in the moment. And we want to be able to stretch ourselves a little bit of what we don't know, to be a little bit uncomfortable. So he goes on to talk about other things. He goes on to talk about, remember when he mentioned the inner voices, and part of becoming more still and mindful is listening more deeply to your internal presence. So they talk about that they're paying attention to the present task at hand, and that by continuing to return to build our practice so we can come back to the moment is where we can build ourselves. So they say there's 22 triggers that bring us into flow that they've researched so far. There's probably more. We're not going to go through all of them. But by being completely concentrated on our own physiology and knowing when we're the most likely to be in the flow, then that allows us to bring a sense of presence. And you might be an early morning person or someone who wakes up in the afternoon or a night owl. None of those things, the timing doesn't matter. But during that time when we're most in the flow and when we want to do something that's creative or bring our attention to another human, that's when we shut out all other distractions and bring ourselves attentive. We have usually 60 to 90 minutes of when we can be the most present in any day. So how do we tap into our time and learn how to use that? And the final thing they say before I talk a little bit more about two clusters, dopamine triggers and motivation triggers. So flow or being only shows up when our presence is here right now. So what we're practicing together over and over is to come back to this present moment as best we can. Then we layer on top of that what our physiology calls for us to do, the timing that's the best for us. And then we may want to meditate during the time. Say you're a morning person, you're awake at 6 or 6:30, and maybe right after that is the time that is the most in the flow, the most being for you. So there's two areas, two of the 22 that they talk about. We have dopamine triggers that allow our dopamine, our serotonin to come more aligned with our body. So surprisingly, what gives us that little rush of pleasure can be things like an interaction with someone we care deeply. It can be something novel or new, something unpredictable. It can be a moment of awe when we watch the moon rise, when we see the stars, when we hear from an old and dear friend. So that can give us that little rush of pleasure. So what we want to do is tune into those. What is it that gives me the most kind of little rush of pleasure? That's when my dopamine. So that's the first cluster of triggers that bring us more attention in the flow. And then the second of the cluster is things like risk taking, being highly social or being intellectual, being spiritual, whatever those elements are for you that bring you so that you've experienced that little rush of pleasure. So that's the first, the dopamine triggers, and there's a number in there. And the second one that second cluster that I'm going to talk about that I think has meaning for us is motivation. So there's certain motivation triggers that we can start to pay attention to. We may already be familiar with them, but we're putting them under the guise of motivation triggers to bring us into a stronger sense of being or in the flow. So 4 areas. Curiosity, that's designed to be built into us. Second is passion. When I feel passionate about something or someone, I can't stop thinking about them or it. It really drives my sense of motivation. The third one is having purpose. And then the fourth one is mastery. Learning, when we learn our purpose, then we bring ourselves so that we can become highly skillful at how we do that. Flow is universal. So all animals and many social mammals and humans, we can become more and more skillful at this. That's part of our commitment and practice that we do. Okay. Motivation, learning, creativity, flow. And the flow amplifies all of us. Okay, so that's a brief